Your weekend is not complete without the First Lady of New York Radio. It's the Joan Hamburg Show. Talk Radio 77 WABC.
I know that you all know Rita Cosby. She's one of the top broadcasters, not only here at ABC, but in the country. And she's done all kinds of things. And I know that people are always saying to me, like, how does someone get started? Well, tell me about someone, Rita Cosby, who's at the station. How do you get to that point? Do you have to move out of town? Do you just audition for different things? Rita has had a fascinating and is having a fascinating career. She's won Emmy. She's won every award known. She's written best-selling books. She's done TV as well as radio. She's interviewed almost all the world leaders, including the popes. You name it, she's done it. And loves to do it. Rita feeds on this, as most good journalists do. And she was one of the first in our industry who talked and looked at prisoners at Guantanamo Bay, actually witnessed an interrogation. She's interviewed heads of states from all over. So, Rita Cosby, welcome, and let's go back to the beginning. When you were a kid, is this what you said? I'm going to grow up and do this, or there were other dreams?
You know what? First of all, I love being on with you, Joan. You know I adore you. And I have always been a passionate person. And I always loved being a journalist. A true story, when I think it was second or third grade, I sent a book into a publishing house and said, I will write this book. It was my version of Old Man and the Sea, if you will. And they wrote back and they said, in 20 years, you are going to be a big best-selling author, but you need at least 20 years on you. I was just a kid sending it in. But I always had these dreams to tell stories and learn. And I grew up in a very international household. You know, my father is Polish and had a very heavy accent, used to always talk about his time in Poland and overseas. He had an unbelievable story himself. And my mother's Danish and grew up in Denmark and then moved to London, met my father. So I always, at the dinner table where, maybe other people were talking about, just what's happening around the corner, I was always hearing about these amazing places in the world and these amazing things that were happening in the world. And my parents always were tuning into the news, always talking about history and the context of history and how important the world was and how interconnected we were. And I really believe that was a big part of me saying, gosh, I want to go to all these great places in the world. So my dream was to always be a foreign correspondent. That was my initial dream, was to cover the world and really be there on the front lines of war zones, which sounds like a crazy story for a kid who was born in Brooklyn, New York, also spent time in Greenwich, Connecticut, and thinking of going to, Afghanistan or going to, Libya, wherever it is, the hot spots around the globe, of which there are many. But that was my dream, and I am so blessed that I was able to fulfill it times 5,000, I think, in many ways, Joan.
Yes, and it's a difficult dream. It was a wonderful dream, but not easy to fulfill, and it started happening to you from the time you were really young. I think you were the youngest senior correspondent for a TV news network, and included in that was covering the White House. That must have been, at that time, one of the big thrills.
Oh, it was enormous, Joan. And in fact, at the time that I was there, I was in Charlotte, North Carolina at a CBS affiliate. And my dream was always to do network news and to do these big stories. And back in that time, when I started, first of all, when I first started, there were not a lot of women in the business. it was mostly guys, especially at the network level. And suddenly this new network came calling to me. I was about to go to maybe London, Mexico City. I speak Spanish. I was going to go to a couple different places where I had a series of different offers. And then suddenly I got a call from this brand new network at the time called Fox News that was planning to create. They hadn't even shaped the network yet at that point, but they had this incredible vision with Rupert Murdoch and others. And they said, here's our plan, and we would love to hire you. And I thought, boy, life is about chances. And it sounded like a really great philosophy. It sounded exciting. And they said, we're going to put you at White House. And I pinched myself, Joan, because I, as somebody, even though I loved all the war zones and everything else, I said, boy, if at some point in my life I could start bring White House. I started at White House at network level, which is amazing because usually that's the place you end up that you aspire to. But I was fortunate enough to essentially start there, and I became senior correspondent. And here I was, probably at least half the age of everybody when I walked into the White House. And at that point, I think of Helen Thomas and Sarah McClendon and people in the business. And boy, you, my friend, because there are people that paved the way for young journalists like myself. And I always admired women and men who had tenacity. I used to always look up to Mike Wallace, too. And I was blessed to get to know Mike Wallace, of course, of the great 60 Minutes. We became friends. And walking into the White House, you would have thought like a Martian had walked in, Joan, because you know what that's like. And boy, do you know, because you were there and paved the way for great, for people like me. But I walk in the door and everybody was like, who is this person, first of all? Who is this kid? Who's this whippersnapper? And what is Fox News? Because, first of all, they didn't know who I was. They didn't even know who Fox News was.
Yeah,
Fox News didn't even have a seat. And then I broke a big scoop. And, Joan, you know what happens when you break a good scoop? I broke a huge scoop that the president had been subpoenaed for Whitewater. And I did it during a press conference with the president of the United States, then President Clinton, and Jacques Chirac. It was a joint press conference, a live press conference. He happened to call on me because I think I was a new, fresh face in the room. He was probably like, who is this, like everybody else? And after I broke the scoop and informed the president he had been subpoenaed, which was a huge scoop. You could have, the room was dead silence. And afterwards, I found out, first of all, everybody in the room came coming over. And I'll never forget this moment. Sarah McClendon, who is the legend, as you know, was, like a Helen Thomas, been there for decades. She comes over and she was in her wheelchair. She wheels over and she goes, kid, you are amazing. Where did you get that scoop, kid? And that's when I knew I made it. And then everybody else in the room was saying, oh, my God, how did you find out? Nobody else in the room knew. And as it turned out, also, the president of the United States didn't know he had been subpoenaed yet. And I found out that Secret Service requested my files. They were trying to get all the background. They thought I was a plant in the room, to ask the question. But I got instant, respect from the people in the room. And I found out that, you could be half the age, but if you work twice as hard, it pays off.
Was that life-changing for you, career-changing?
I think going to Fox News was career-changing in general, and that moment was definitely a pivotal moment for me, but I think that there were a lot of other moments that I covered the Montana Freemen early on. I had a lot of different scoops because I covered, obviously, Washington, but covered everywhere else. And in fact, it's so funny, Joan, in the early days of Fox News, people don't realize this is before even Fox News Channel launched. When I went in for the interview, they said, we're going to put you in Washington, but your beat is going to be everything other than OJ. Can you imagine this? Okay. Eric Shaw, who I love, who is still there at Fox News, his beat covering the first O.J. trial, the first O.J. Simpson trial, which, of course, was covering, was wall to wall in the world. And they said, we're going to put you in Washington, you're going to do White House and everything else, but you will cover everything other than O.J. So I literally went, I remember one day with the shirt on my back, and I came back 3 months later and probably covered, maybe 80, 90 stories in between the president, between hurricanes, the Olympics I covered. I covered TWA 800. I remember it went on and on and on, no matter if it was a natural disaster, I was overseas. I remember coming back one day, I'm like, what apartment do I live in? Because I think only spent about a week or two in my own apartment that I had just gotten, I mean, but it was an incredible time.
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
No, and I remember that I went to Cuba with a bunch of broadcasters, and in those days you had to go. We went on some kind of art trip, some reason that they agreed to let us get in, and they took us to restaurants that served chicken. You went to Cuba and you met with Castro. And even though the guide we had said she had an affair with Castro, it wasn't very helpful to us getting any closer to him. But you actually met with him.
I got stuck in an elevator with Castro, by the way, which was an interesting story. And I speak fluent Spanish. So I started speaking with him in Spanish, and he loved it. And he was like, who is this person? And we ended up having a very interesting conversation with him and also his team. Oh. And my Spanish, by the way, Joan, also helped me tremendously with Pope Francis. That was an amazing moment. I went over to the Vatican. And it was right after
you went
Pope
with
Francis's,
an interview Rita planned, or you went to try to get it?
I went with the intent to be able to hopefully meet him and shake his hand. Uh-huh. And then because I had met the other popes and had some contacts at the Vatican, they said, we're going to put you in a prime position. And we will put you in a place where if he knows you're here, he knows you would like to ask some questions. And if he feels inclined, because nobody tells the Pope what to do or what not to do, then he'll speak. But this is an interesting story. And this is why I tell young people to learn other languages, because I did it a year in Spain, in University of Sevilla in Spain, when I was in college. And it helped me with Castro. It's helped me when I covered the hostage crisis in Lima, Peru. But also, suddenly I'm not too far away from the Pope, and I'm ready to ask some questions to him if I have this moment. It's right before this historic Mideast Peace Summit, and it was right after Pope Francis, now the Pope, of course. He was a new Pope at that time, and nobody really knew that he didn't speak English very well, because Pope John Paul spoke very good English. And so people didn't really understand. He's from Argentina, but he didn't speak very good English. His Spanish is obviously his native tongue. And so as he's walking over to me, Joan, the Swiss guard, one of the guys over there, comes over to me who I'd met before, and he said, Rita, you know what? You should, if you know Spanish, ask him in Spanish. There's a good trick for you. There's a good, tip for you to use. And I thought, okay. And I'm thinking Mideast peace. It's a lofty topic. It's not like a knife and fork, basic words. So I'm switching in my mind. I had about 10, 20 seconds to switch into Spanish in my mind. And I started asking him questions in Spanish about Mideast peace. And the Pope loved it. And he kept coming back and answering questions to me. Then he came back again, and it ended up being the first interview with an American journalist with the Pope there. And it was an incredible moment for me. And for me, I walked away, Joan, you know me, in the moment, I was so so in the zone because I thought how incredible to be in front of this man who is such a remarkable. I always love the people that I'm interviewing. I'm in it because I think people sense sincerity, and I sincerely love what I do every day here on WABC to talk to so many interesting people or to talk to the Pope. And I walked away saying, oh gosh, I hope, what a moment to speak to the guy. And then a few minutes later, I went, oh my gosh, I got an interview with him.
Right, in Spanish.
And then I didn't want to wash my hands for about a year because I got to touch the Pope.
I understand. And it's an interesting lesson, too, because you learned Spanish or even became fluent when you were a college kid and took that semester abroad.
It was so pivotal. And I have some interesting stories as a young blonde woman surviving Spain in college.
Yeah.
That was one of the record books, Joan.
No, that's true. But then when did you start making it as a correspondent? Right after college, what kind of job did you get?
Well, I knew in college, and in fact, I was blessed. I actually did some movies and some commercials and things when I was in college. And I tell everybody, mentors are key. And just being, the first person there, the last person to leave, the hardest working, and just doing the best job you can. And I was fortunate through a movie set that I was working on, I met a contact who knew Diane Sawyer. And one day, I tell everybody, one of the greatest calls of my life, I'm in my dorm room in college, and Diane Sawyer calls me and said, I heard I got to meet you, that you are just terrific and you are hardworking and you want to get into broadcasting. And I was already studying in college. And that opened the door, that conversation and friendship with the incredible Diane Sawyer opened the door for me to get, I thought, the greatest internship in the country, which it really was at the time. I was blessed. It was with Dan Rather. And at the time, he was the giant, in the business.
Well, even when we look back, there was no one better than Dan.
And he was terrific to me. I was so blessed, and what an incredible journalist, and to learn from him. So I became the intern at CBS Evening News. And then Dan Rather and I did this demo tape that, for Dan, of course, I was just the kid, the intern, but Dan did this demo tape of what it looked like standing up delivering the news. Nobody had been doing the news standing up back then, Joan. Remember, everybody used to sit behind the desk. And there wasn't a lot of movement. It was very traditional, but they wanted to test this, incredible new idea of Dan standing up behind the desk and moving a little bit. So he was one of the first ones to try it out, and they needed somebody to be the correspondent, the sort of fake correspondent, if you will, for the real. So Dan came to me and he said, kid, you said you want to be a journalist, you want to be a war correspondent, you want to cover events. Why don't you be my mock correspondent? But I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to ask you. And we'll just have you come on set. And I was this gutsy young kid, and I knew the news. I was always one of these people who loved, following current events and studying it. Exactly. So he plopped me in, and I did a whole bunch of stuff on, I remember we talked about Daniel Ortega, we talked about NASA, we talked about other things. And he ended up sending that tape out unbeknownst to me. I didn't know what they were doing. I was just honored to spend more time with Dan Rather. They sent it out to every CBS station around the country. And I already had done interviews and had gotten a number of job offers already prior to that. But I ended up getting all these other calls from around the country going, Dan Rather's great, but who's the kid?
That's so funny.
Which was very funny. So it took off from there. But before that, I had already done an internship with Bakersfield, California, which was right outside of Los Angeles, but had, believe it or not, this sounds crazy, but had one of the highest crime rates in the country. But it had just a lot of stories that I always liked, hard news. And it was, important stories, whether it was there, immigration was a huge issue, which it certainly is today.
Oh, my gosh.
Crime,
right there.
Economy. Absolutely. And I ended up working there in Bakersfield, which I loved back then. And I was there for 3 years. Then I worked in Charlotte, North Carolina for 3 years. And then the rest is history. I had all these calls from different networks, and that's when I started working for Fox News, which was just incredible, and NBC News as well, which was also an incredible moment. But I think back, Joan, and how blessed I am to be able to cover and go to a lot of these places that I used to hear about at my dinner table as a child, but now I can say I have been there and just met some extraordinary stories that have shaped my life and hopefully helped other people too along the way.
Well, and Rita, one of the important points is that you went. When kids call me and ask about, how to get into this business or television or even print, which is diminishing, they don't want to leave New York. They say, well, I want to be here and I want to start. They don't understand you've got to pay your dues. And look at all the places that you started in to get to the next spot. And it wasn't necessarily your very first choice, but you went where the opportunity was and took a chance.
Absolutely. And that's what I tell young people, too. And I think it applies not just in broadcasting, but in life, that you treat people with respect and you do your homework, and you do more homework than the next person. And it's funny, I go back to Diane Sawyer, who told me early on, because I remember saying, in college to her, what's the secret? And she said, not a lot of sleep. Get by with not a lot of sleep. And I'm thinking, that's interesting advice. And now I know what she means, because I can't think of, there are so many times, Joan, where I would get a call. I'll never forget the story I mentioned about Lima, Peru, at the hostage crisis. I'm at the mall shopping with my mother. I'm with my brother. We're celebrating, it's right before Christmas. We're buying each other Christmas gifts. I had a Christmas sweater on with bells on, and I'm dressed in high heels and a velvet skirt. And I get a call from then Fox News saying, Rita, can you go to Lima, Peru? We need you with your Spanish. The hostage crisis, it was the big Shining Path terrorist groups that had taken a whole bunch of people at the embassy. It was the biggest story in the world at that point. And I said, sure, I'm happy to. And then they called back about a minute later and said, could you leave right now? I thought they were going to say, hey, after Christmas or after this. And I'm like, right now? And literally, Joan, I used to always travel, and I still do, with my passport with me. I have my passport and a little bit of cash. That's all I had. And I went to Lima, Peru, dressed up like I was going to a Christmas party. And I remember riding on the plane from New York to Miami. There was a layover in Miami. What I needed. And I literally had, I think it was like an hour and a half at the airport layover. And I bought underwear. I was like, okay, what do I need? What are the priorities? So, underwear, toothpaste, maybe a T-shirt to sleep in. It was interesting. It was the essentials to get by in. And I ended up getting whatever I bought. I think I ended up wearing that for 3-4 days straight, because the story became the biggest story in the world, and we were working round the clock. And as soon as I landed, the minute I landed, they whisked me off, and I was on the air, I think maybe 5-10 minutes later, as soon as I got to the site.
It's unbelievable, and you've done live coverage from many devastated places, as well as where the stories are breaking. The immigration story gets worse and worse, and you've been involved in that. You've been to the border.
I have been to the border many times. And Joan, I think going to the story, when we share the story now on air, on WABC, and which I feel so blessed to do with John Katzimatidis on Katz and Cosby, and then we have the Rita Cosby show. These two shows, our listeners, what I love doing is being able to say, hey, yeah, I've been there, because it gives you such a greater appreciation, because you know exactly what our law enforcement are battling with. You know exactly what our ranchers and what our citizens are battling with on the front lines. And one of the scariest days, and I've been in, in war zones, I've been in Afghanistan, as you mentioned, I've been in Libya, I've been in Syria. There have been some very hot spots, Kosovo, scary places where I've been. And I think about also on our U.S. border. I was there through the night with one of the local sheriffs years ago. And I'll never forget, we're there, and a gunboat pulls up with drug lords. heavily armed drug lords. And I'm with the sheriff and his local deputies who have their little handguns. I mean, it looks like, like they were so outmanned, so outgunned. We're hiding behind a tree with the sheriffs, because what else are you going to do when suddenly a boat full of drug lords with submachine guns are coming towards you? And that's what our law enforcement are dealing with every single day. And it just goes to show just how dangerous an open border is, with the drug traffickers, with the human smuggling, and our law enforcement, they are have guts of steel to go up against them and to do whatever they can to protect the homeland, whether it's there or whether it's on the streets of New York. It's a tough fight. And these people, when you're dealing with the kind of money that the cartels have financed, whether it's through drugs or the human trafficking or the sex trafficking, but they are so well armed, so well financed. It's such an intricate network and such an organized network now, an international network well beyond even Mexico. It's a frightening scenario, but you have to pray for our law enforcement, because boy, do they have guts of steel. I just remember looking at that sheriff thinking, how do you do this every single day?
Every day. And it seems to be getting worse and worse, or at least through the eyes of the public, that things are really bad and falling apart. And you probably have noted, people don't have faith necessarily in our elected representatives, who seem to be it's always about them, not about the public they represent.
Yeah, but you are so right. You know what? And that's why our job is to call them out. Because when you have been to the border or been to a lot of these places, you could say, wait a minute, that's not exactly the case. This is what's really happening. And so many of our politicians are just trying to spin the yarn, especially this year when it's an election year.
Right, get elected.
Which is why, going back to the young kid, calling out the president or calling out whoever, that's what I think a journalist's primary job is every single day, is to be the voice for the people and to speak out. And no matter whether it's a Republican, Democrat, Independent, whatever it is, call them out, because we deserve to have fair representation, and we deserve to have fair facts. And sometimes it's a little hard, especially in an election year where everybody seems to have an agenda.
Is there something you haven't done that you long to do?
You know what? I had at one point, there are people who are no longer with us that I wish I had had a chance to interview. I had a chance at one point to interview Saddam Hussein.
Right.
And he had agreed to do an interview with me, but it was right before we knew that the U.S. was about to strike, literally about to strike. President Bush had just announced he's about to strike, and Saddam's people didn't believe he was about to strike. And I said, he just announced it publicly. I'm not telling any inside secrets. So there's ones that I wish I had done. I had an interview with Putin that was planned, and instead I ended up doing other interviews at that time. Maybe I would love to be able to grill him now, to be able to say, what the heck are you doing to the world and to Ukraine? Yes, what a time. So I think there's always a bucket list. It depends on the day. But that's what keeps us, you know what I love? I love every day, Joan, being able to wake up and you never know who you're going to be interviewing, where you're going to be going. And we are so blessed that every day, it's interesting. Even on Cats and Cosby, we have the 1 hour every day. And John and I, there are so many interesting stories. And John has such a great depth of background with his incredible business background and his incredible mind. Every day I learn from him, and I learn from all the great guests that we have. And I also we get to talk to the most interesting people all over the world, and it often changes even while we're on live news breaks. So I can't think of a better business where, every day is new and thriving and a dream. And I just pray for the world. I mean, that's what we try to do every day, is talk about common sense and just talk about what matters to people, and having a purpose every day, and having a love of knowledge and a love of trying to make a difference. I can't think of a greater business. And to be at ABC, where we're hitting such a home run, and to be with John and the great Cats and Cosby team, I have to pinch myself now twice every day, not just once after the Pope, but now twice every day.
And that's Rita Cosby. You can hear her here every day. doing her thing and bringing the world to all of you. Thank you so much, Rita. Take care. I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Joan. Love being with you. And thanks for just inspiring me every single year. You are one of the best in the business, and we're so lucky to have you, my friend.
Thank you, my dear. I appreciate it. And we'll talk soon. And I'm Joan Hamburg, and you're listening to Rita Cosby right here on WABC Radio. More ahead.